Hey, Matt.
Hi, Dan.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
All right. The rest of my, region is still recovering from yesterday's AFC Championship game, though.
Yeah, no, it was a pretty thrilling game.
It was a hell of a game, I'm not a Patriots fan, but growing up in Connecticut, I have schizophrenic sports loyalties. I'm a Red Sox fan, but I'm also a New York Giants fan in football. But
I guess I approve of that.
Right, thanks. But that was just such a fun game to watch.
It was, except it was painful for me because I dislike the Patriots. I dislike the Colts. I dislike the Colts-Patriots rivalry. I've been sort of dreading this game all week.
Why do you dislike the rivalry?
What?
Why do you dislike the rivalry?
Well, just because, because rivalries are great, but when you dislike both sides of the rivalry, it's frustrating. And
okay, then you have to.
Frustrating than when they play such a great game. And I really wished I could have taken a rooting interest in that, but.
See, I don't know. I understand why you would dislike the Patriots just because they've won, and I assume that the image they project. What's wrong with the Colts?
I mean, the problem with the Colts is Peyton Manning is an incredibly overexposed, sort of annoying figure, and especially now that he's won the big game, right? I mean, this is always the knock.
He's won the big game for 2 weeks. You realize, in 2 weeks from now, if he has a bad Super Bowl game, we're going to see exactly the same sort of crap that was written about Manning for the last year, couple of years, resurface.
Well, I certainly hope so, because if he wins the Super Bowl, he's going to become, 85% of commercials on television are going to feature Peyton Manning. But, and I think he needs to be stopped.
I'll defend overexposure in Manning's case, because, correct me if I'm wrong, he's actually picked some good commercials. There isn't a single commercial I've seen him do where I think, oh, God, that's so lame. I mean, they're pretty smart.
I think the one he's currently in for the HD TVs is pretty terrible.
Which one is that one?
I did like the one where he was cheering on the guy bagging groceries.
Oh, I like the one cheering on groceries. Come on, that was a nice reverse where he gets the. I like the one you mean where he gets the, the apron at the end.
Right, no, that's what I was saying. That's a good one.
Yeah.
His other commercials, I'm not that big on. His little brothers kind of destroyed the Giants, I think. Which is really not his fault. But I just had animus against the whole kind of Manning.
It's the whole Manning clan is basically what's going on.
Yeah, and whatever. He doesn't need to be winning Super Bowls and stuff. I'm all about the Bears.
I understand. I disagree in that I actually want Manning to win, I want him to do well. I have divided loyalties because I lived in Chicago long enough to pull for the Bears. Mm-hmm. But I'm actually sick of the Manning is a choker meme. That bothers the heck out of me. Because, it's just, sometimes he's throwing bad passes. Sometimes it's not his fault. I mean, one game they lost because, the Richard Seymour made a hell of a run stuff.
No, I agree that the meme is unfair. I mean, for example, had the Colts lost the game yesterday,
right,
this would have added to the legend of Peyton Manning is a choker.
Right.
Even if, the Colts had scored 38 points and the Patriots had just scored 41.
Exactly. If Brady had driven down and actually scored a touchdown on that last drive, it would have been, again, Manning can't win the big one, which was absurd.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Even though that has something to do with it, the Colts, the weakness of the Colts all throughout recent history has always been on the defensive side.
Right.
And yet, losses will get attributed to Manning, who's obviously not perfect, but a very good quarterback.
There is a tendency to blame the quarterback or to overly blame and overly praise the quarterback for things that often he has nothing to do with. I agree with that.
Right, you saw that. It's part of what I think made the whole Colts-Patriots dynamic a little aggravating, is that both teams, you've seen a lot of that overpraising of Tom Brady for the Patriots' performance in those matchups, and over-criticism of Peyton Manning for his performance when, obviously half the game is being played on the defensive end, or, almost half, and there's special teams, and there's more to offense than just the quarterbacks. Yeah. And yet, it'll all be down to who makes the big plays, who's a choker, allegedly. And it's all pretty statistically illiterate as well.
Yeah, well, part of the problem, though, I think Michael Lewis made this point in one of his sports articles, is that the problem with football, let's face it, most sports geeks, when they talk about statistics, are all baseball geeks, because a lot of the statistics in baseball are individual. The problem with football is trying to measure it on a statistical level becomes next to impossible because they're all team statistics. I mean, even the individual statistics are so team dependent that you can't really grade them independently. You know, you can't evaluate a player independently of the team.
Right, but I mean, oftentimes, I mean, that's a good point, but I mean, oftentimes the sort of innumeracy goes worse than that.
Yeah.
The quarterback will be blamed for a loss in which his team performed above average offensively.
Right, now that's well, I mean,
which is just crazy. Yeah. But you see it all the time when it's simple to check what's the average number of points scored in an NFL game.
Yeah.
Right, and when teams score more than that number,
and yet the offense somehow let them down.
To blame the quarterback if they lose nonetheless.
Well, I think the thing that I've liked about football this year, I mean, what struck me is that, I mean, yesterday's AFC game was so good, and then all the divisional games were also very good.
Yes.
And the fact is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that seems unusual to me, because in a lot of playoff games, you know, usually it's about a 50-50 shot you're going to watch a good game. Like, I mean, a competitive game that in the fourth quarter still has meaning. Whereas most of the games this year in the playoffs have had, you know, the fourth quarter's still been relevant.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, traditionally, when playoff time comes around, you find yourself some of these games frustrated that, unlike during the regular season, you can't flip to the other game.
And I mean,
but this here, it's always been games worth watching. I think.
And this might be a generational thing, because I have to admit, when I was growing up, you know, and when you form your formative sports experiences, I remember the Super Bowl and most of the playoffs being unbelievably boring. They were blowouts, or some teams screwed up a lot, and it just was never competitive. Whereas, you know, on the other hand, like the NCAA championship game, the basketball championship game, had like a string of unbelievable games. So it's good to see, you know, and then in recent years, baseball's gotten its due. There's been a lot of great baseball series. I'm glad to see football, you know, again, that game yesterday was it was such a fun game to watch, just in terms of, you know, the back and forth. You know, first, you know, the Patriots went ahead, then the Colts come back, and then it was punch, counter punch, punch, counter punch. And, I mean, that was just fun to watch, you know, from an aesthetic sense, I guess. I don't know.
We agree. Football's good.
Football's good. All right, we should move from this to slightly more serious topics.
Sure. Iraq is not so great.
Yeah, there's been a whole series of blog posts out there, mine included, about sort of, you know, should we apologize for the position we had on Iraq prior to the war? What responsibility do we have? You know, were our thought processes correct? Is the left crowing too much? You know, are the pundits who got things right in Iraq not being properly rewarded in the pundit, you know, merit system? That might be an oxymoron, you know.
Sure.
So, you know, tell me your thoughts on this.
You know, one, I guess, like, central node in this debate was a Radar magazine article.
Right. I think that started off the latest round, yeah.
Right. Which, obviously was not conducting a statistically valid survey,
no.
but looked at a couple people who very prominently argued, pundits who very prominently argued for the Iraq War, and looked at the way that, despite the fact that the things they said, have turned out to be wrong, oftentimes by their own admission,
right.
they've moved on to only greater levels of stature, fame, fortune, etc., whereas people, more marginal people whose warnings look pretty prescient, have tended not to benefit. John Shate wrote a column in response to this,
right?
Where I think he's quite correct to say that, in detail, you can probably raise questions about any particular person, pundit who is against the war beforehand, and give good reasons why they might not be hired, and so on and so forth. But I did feel like John was missing the overall trend. That as best I can tell, there are no examples of prominent newspapers, say, hiring columnists since the war.
Yeah.
Who were, in a way that suggested that what the paper was doing was saying, hey, this guy seems pretty smart, let's put him up there.
Yeah, he got Iraq right, maybe we should have, give him a voice. Yeah, although, first of all, my thought on the pundit thing was, you're right, the Radar story was, just sort of, here are a couple anecdotes, and you can jerry-rig those any way you want. First of all, let's face it, to be a good pundit, it would help to be right, obviously. Although God knows that's not a prerequisite for this job description. But there are some other things that do matter as well. You have to write well, for example. And also, That's one thought. And one of the things that struck me is that a lot of the people that he pointed to that got promoted are very good writers. And I don't mean that just in the sense of pure prose, but they're good at the craft. It's not easy to pen an 800 to 1,200 word argument twice a week or however often these jobs are. So, the fact that someone got something right on a rock doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be good at this stuff in the future. The second thing I would point out, I thought Chait pointed this out, but it's worth, reflecting. If they got a rock right, but they got a lot of stuff wrong before that, does that disqualify, I don't know if a rock in and of itself is sufficient to justify someone being promoted. Now, that said, a lot of the people who got a rock wrong might have gotten other stuff wrong as well. So
right. But I do think that this is where the question of broad trends comes into play, right? That, you look at the example that's in the article of Peter Beinart being first given a very generous book contract, then being made a columnist at Time Magazine, and being given a fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, these things happen because he's a very smart and interesting writer.
Right.
He, so on and so forth. But at the same time...
We should probably fully disclose, Beinart not hired me exactly, but was the one who got me onto TNR Online when I wrote for them. Right. I'm sure you know Peter as well.
You don't seem to see any examples of something like that happening with someone who was against the war. Again, Chait himself was made and prominently argued in favor of the war, was quite wrong-headed about a lot of the predictions, forecasts he made. He was hired as a columnist at the LA Times.
Right.
He's a really great columnist. Lots of people... I think everybody agrees that, he's one of the most clever writers out there, especially in that kind of short format. Seems like a smart hire. But the point is still that when the LA Times op-ed page made that changeover, in which he was hired and Jonah Goldberg was hired, it uniformly moved toward having more foreign policy hawks, even though seemingly events on the ground had pushed things in another direction. And whereas, people, it seems to me to be the case that in America, if you make a bad judgment on the dovish side of an issue, that does much, much more harm to your reputation than the reverse.
That is
a real and important phenomenon. The sort of incentive structure is almost always to be more pro-war.
I would say two things. First, this ties into the thing you talked about, on foreignpolicy.com, the Kahneman and Renshin article that argues that sort of human beings are hardwired to favor hawkish policy options. And maybe this is what you're talking about now with the pundit version of that. That is, if you adopt a hawkish position and you're wrong, you don't suffer the penalty as much as if you adopt a dovish position. But the second thing I would say is, there's also a difference here between... And I think this gets to a larger question. To what extent do you ascribe responsibility to pundits for making wrong predictions, as opposed to, let's say, the politicians? Because, I think the politicians who supported Iraq are going to be paying a really heavy price come 2008. The presidential ones, for example. I think, let's face it, Hillary's going to have to explicate her Iraq position. McCain is going to be trapped, I think, by his own rhetoric in terms of saying we need to expand in Iraq as opposed to retreat. So, part of this is, why is it I think it's an interesting question. Politicians, I think, are going to pay a serious price, and yet pundits don't. And that might be a good thing. I'm not sure politicians should pay a heavier price. They're the ones who actually have real responsibility. I've heard it argued that pundits, because they're in the marketplace of ideas, bear some kind of responsibility, but that's a vague... I'm not sure how you crystallize that.
Yes, I do think, obviously one of the institutional failings of journalism, of, writing, punditry as an endeavor, is, I think, to overstate the degree of actual impact that it has, and that one of the sort of signal, not that all bloggers are committed to this idea, but that an idea that I think is prevalent among bloggers and sort of wrong-headed is to dramatically overstate the significance of media coverage, and in particular of opinion journalism in generating events. I really like the job I have. I consider myself privileged to be able to be paid to say what I think about the events of the day.
That's pretty cool, yeah.
But I think there's very little evidence to suggest that it's actually all that important in terms of determining outcomes in the world, what people like me say about this.
Well, it depends. I mean, there are political communications people who do think that the media, the media is a very important filter through which individuals collect information, about how the world works. And also, if you believe that, particularly on foreign policy, that a lot of the sort of politics of foreign policy making are driven not necessarily just by public attitudes, but also by elite beliefs, then these positions do acquire more, importance because, let's say, really potentially influential people might be influenced by what a Tom Friedman says or what a Paul Krugman says or, what a David Brooks says.
No, I do think it's more plausible on the foreign policy end where elites seem to be more significant than on the other realm.
Well,
but still, there's a question in my mind as to how much some of the sorts of things that people pay attention to really matter. I mean, in part because a lot of the media figures who bloggers are obsessed with are people who really have an audience only of political junkies.
Such as, give me an example here.
So for example, the New Republic as a magazine, or the American Prospect, where I write for, right? These are very small circulation niche publications whose audiences, the mere fact that you're subscribing to a publication like that, or even bothering to read it for free on the internet, indicates that you have a wildly larger level of interest in politics than most people do.
Yeah, I might add this is particularly exacerbated in foreign policy because Americans are generally singularly uninterested in foreign policy. Unless it affects a pocketbook issue compared to domestic politics. And in fact, almost all the polling evidence shows that Americans wished politicians cared much more about domestic policy than foreign policy.
Right.
So the gap is even greater in this dimension. I agree with you.
Right. And so, sometimes... it's possible that on foreign policy that means because the public is just so indifferent that these very inside baseball publications wind up mattering a great deal. At the same time, it seems that on domestic issues, it probably barely matters at all. At least in terms of moving public opinion. To say, what kind of coverage do you get? Even on something like the O'Reilly factor, which has a big audience compared to a magazine, but a tiny audience.
Compared to, large numbers of voters. Yeah.
Right. And an aware audience. When I was interning for a communications director on Hill, his attitude was always that the most important kinds of coverage were the ones you get in the non-political media. That like the local TV news.
Right.
Or things where people who aren't interested in politics might hear about a politician.
Right, where they would not, and that's the only piece of information they're going to get.
Right.
Yeah.
Because those are people whose opinions are going to be swayed by very minor things.
Right.
Because they're not paying attention. They don't really care.
No, that's a fair point. Well, to bring this back to the pundit thing, though, so, on the one hand, I think that the claim that, this is somehow stacking the political deck against, I can understand the complaint by some people who support, who oppose the war, saying we deserve, more pundit positions. But I'm not sure even if the deck is stacked against them, I'm skeptical of the effect it has, I guess.
No, I agree with that. Although, specifically, one of the posts from the more hawkish side, or a couple of them, have sort of, been like hawks, expressing the view that, doves are gloating too much. Where, of course, anytime anyone's gloating, it's too much, but at the same time, it's certainly the case that in, say,
April 2003.
May of 2003, hawks were not shy about gloating.
No, I did. I did. I had Michael Kinsley back in April 2003 wrote a piece saying, just because you won the war doesn't mean you won the argument about the war. And I posted a response. And I'd like to think it was thoughtful, but there was some crowing in there, no question about it, because I assumed incorrectly, as it turned out, that the war was over. And that, the cost, therefore all the costs and all that sort of stuff, had finished. And that was my mistake, clearly. And that was one of the things that I talked about in sort of my mea culpa about where I got Iraq wrong.
Now, I do think that if you go back and you look at what people were saying before the war, it's very rare that you see anyone on either side of the issue who actually predicted the course of events that would come forward.
Yeah. Well, and part of the problem with this
that's because it's like it's asking too much of somebody to do that, because especially when you have something where there's like, the actor, George W. Bush, his administration, has like a plan, and then the plan doesn't work out. Nobody could possibly forecast exactly how the various players in the game are going to react with one another over a period of 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody really did.
Right, and not only that, I mean, part of the problem is that, there are people who say, well, these pundits got a rock wrong. The problem is that assumes it was a one-shot decision. And if you go back, I mean, even the run-up to the war, I mean, we're talking about 6 months of a whole series of decisions that the administration and other people made about how to go about this, and then, post-invasion, what was, going to be done as well. And the problem is that your position in September of 2002, for example, might be, you might have been right in September 2002, but then you adjusted, let's say, after Powell made his speech or something, and then adopted a different position. And so part of the problem is that it wasn't like everyone, suddenly made a decision, all right, now I'm going to decide if I'm in favor of it or not. This was a slow-motion decision-making process that all of us went through. And, in some cases, I mean, for example, you, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, you were sort of in favor of the war, then you finally decided no. I mean, I can't remember what your exact...
I was one of, people, I think, tend not to portray themselves this way, but I was one of, I think, a large number of people who were more or less for the war, had kind of doubts about it, and then near the last minute, when there was these UN things going on, the inspectors were there, blah, 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 did not, to my detriment, it wasn't like I suddenly had this eureka moment and realized it was all bad, but was saying, the week before the invasion, I don't see why Bush is so determined to invade this week. I don't understand why we can't keep going through with this process.
Yeah.
I didn't make any particularly accurate predictions as to what the downside was. I'm not a person who is inclined to think that, like, war is a great idea. I kind of believed in all of that, last resort kind of notion. And it just seemed clear that at that moment, with inspectors on the ground, with an uncertain kind of diplomatic situation, with the United States being weirdly unable to get the cooperation of, like, even these really sort of third-rate countries on the Security Council, that there wasn't, like, a really pressing need to go in, except for... now it's clearer to me, much clearer, why the administration wanted to invade at that point, which was, I think, precisely that they were afraid that if the inspection process was able to continue, that Saddam would get a clean bill of health.
I wouldn't phrase it like that. I mean, the problem is, and you got to remember, this is one thing I do remember at the mindset in 2003. I was less exercised about the WMD issue. I mean, my concern was, and I articulated this in the blog post. I didn't think the sanction regime was helping the United States because we were, being accused of humanitarian disaster in Iraq, and I wanted U.S. forces out of Saudi Arabia. But that said, I mean, the problem is, it's never clear to me. It was never clear to me going in. I think the assumption that a lot of people had, and this might be where some, anti-war pundits should be, like Scott Ritter should be vindicated, is most people assumed that even if he didn't, there wasn't a lot of evidence, that he was trying to get WMD, and that, you were never going to be able to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that he wasn't trying to. And so the problem, I think, was that even if you had all the inspections and the inspections turned up nothing, the Bush administration response would have been, that's just because the inspections on their own won't work. That, clearly he's outsmarted the UN. And the fact is, given Hussein's past behavior, as most foreign policy people would have thought, it would have been harder to have disputed that assertion by the Bush administration. I don't think the administration was being devious in claiming that they thought he was trying to acquire WMD. I think they just genuinely believed that they thought it was obvious, and they didn't want to be bothered with the fact that they couldn't get any evidence to support that.
No, but I mean, this is exactly what I mean. That their great fear was that they were not going to believe anything the inspectors, the Bush administration, was not prepared to believe anything the inspectors said. They thought, as you said, that the historical record was sufficient proof that Saddam was determined to get WMD.
The point I want to make on that just quickly is
they were concerned that if the inspection process unfolded, right, this political and diplomatic problem for them would develop, where al-Baradei and Blix issued very definitive sounding statements that say, we looked up and down, we didn't find evidence, and then the Bush administration is left with this policy problem where either they need to accept the idea that Saddam has disarmed and sort of let him out of the box, the metaphorical box, which they don't want to do because they think it's an untrustworthy regime, or else they need to invade in an even worse diplomatic situation. Obviously, the mistake that everybody made, not literally everybody, but that
but that a lot. I want to be clear about this.
Was that
Matt, hold on. I want to be clear about this.
Thought Saddam had disarmed.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear about this, though. I mean, it was not only the Bush administration that made that assumption of he's got to have them, regardless of the inspections. I think that assumption was very widespread within the United States.
Sure, I mean, to take the Bush administration's hands off of it, I mean, Richard Holbrooke and Kenneth Pollock, who, are Democrats, Clinton administration hands, and who I think are actually the sort of people where it would make more sense to talk about accountability than newspaper columnists. They both wrote before the war that it was a mistake to even begin doing the inspections process at the UN, that nothing that the inspections process did or didn't turn up was actually going to change their view of the merits of the situation, and that it was only going to make gaining international support for invading more complicated, and that it would be a mistake to go in for that. Obviously, those guys proved completely wrong about all that. But it wasn't an idiosyncratic notion of the Bush administration. It was widespread in America's sort of national security establishment.
Right. And I will say this. The one guy who I actually think does deserve some sort of rehabilitation, pundit-wise, is Scott Ritter. Because Ritter, clearly nailed both the fact that Hussein, he was the guy in the mid-'90s who said, no. Hussein's not complying with, with the inspections the way you think he is, and it turned out I think he was right about that. And then said later, no, but he's still, he's changed his mind. So in the end, he's the guy who I think had the highest batting average, and yet a lot of places, including the New Republic, I remember there was a story on that tried to paint him pretty much as a kook.
Right. Well, and I think on both sides, right, the best place to talk about accountability is the place where it's been talked about least, but is neither elected officials nor columnists and writers, but the sort of expert class who both kinds of people rely on for
someone like
information and analysis of complicated situations.
You mean like, academics, researchers, think tank people?
Well, the think tank people, the policy heads, especially a guy like Kenneth Pollock, whose book was obviously an important element of the war debate, right? Mm-hmm. And whose claim to fame is not that he is like, a thought-provoking thinker with witty 700-word columns, right?
No, he's writing serious
columns. The
columns,
idea of his standing was that he was a CIA officer charged with doing Persian Gulf military analysis, that he was on the Clinton administration's National Security Council. The reason he was so influential was precisely that he had served in Democratic administrations. It made arguments coming from the Bush administration look less like narrow partisan political arguments. That this analysis was shared, and you have to ask yourself, when somebody like that proves to be wrong in his analysis of an area that goes to the very heart of his core specialty, well, should this really continue to be our go-to guy on this question?
Well, this leads to a nice segue, I think, from Iraq to Iran, because let's face it, we're basically we're having a replay of this conversation now, with Iran, and I know you've participated in some of this, and a lot of the TNR guys have done it as well, which is, all right, given the fact that we were so badly wrong about a number of things about Iraq, and yet now we've got a country that in some ways there's much more specific evidence that A, they're trying to acquire a nuclear weapons program, and B, one of their leaders at least seems crazy in not a good way. What should the U.S. response be on Iran?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, specifically, most recently, Richard Just wrote some posts at the New Republic's blog doing what I think is honestly the most infuriating thing in the world. I should say he said in one of these infuriating posts that he likes and respects me, so I'll reciprocate that. But one of these things where someone says, well, I'm not necessarily saying we should bomb Iran, but I'm worried that people aren't taking this seriously enough. And, I don't really know what that means. But I take it that the people urging me to take this more seriously are in fact, trying to start up a war. I'm
trying to go through the camera to shake you by the lapels and make you take this seriously, Matt.
In favor of the idea that we should, launch a preventative military campaign against Iran. But I do think the idea that Iran is likely to launch an unprovoked nuclear first strike on Israel, which was the specific subject of our dispute, and which you see a certain amount in the press, is just crazy. And that there's honestly no reason whatsoever to believe that that's true.
Matt, let me ask you this. On the one hand, I've read through a lot of this stuff, and I agree with you that assuming that you've got the current distribution of power within Iran stays as it is. I think there was actually a New York Times story that triggered a lot of this, where Khamenei basically told, Ahmadinejad, you're not allowed to talk about anything regarding, nukes ever again. Mm-hmm. I would agree with you. Now, let me tweak a hypothetical at you. Let's say that Ahmadinejad and the Revolutionary Guards actually succeeded in overthrowing Khamenei and installing, someone more consistent with the sort of Khomeini line of theology as the head of Iran's leadership. Would you then agree that there would be a concern that they would launch a first strike? Or are you saying it doesn't matter?
Really, no. I think the notion, I think that there is overwhelming, theoretical grounds to believe that a country would not do something like that, that the empirical evidence from the history of the Iranian regime gives no reason to believe that there's some kind of suicidal impulse within it, and that the occasional, piece of rhetoric from Ahmadinejad does not, seriously call any of that into question. There's a lot of things that leaders say. Mao Zedong was famous for having sort of mused about the People's Republic of China's ability to survive a nuclear war, which at least was a plausible thing for him to think.
Yeah.
There are, especially for Israel, but also for the United States, real reasons to wish that Iran would not develop a nuclear bomb, and I think this is, a legitimate question. I think that launching military strikes on Iran is not a useful way to deal with that concern.
Right now, I agree with you. Yeah, absolutely.
But, one way or the other, actually. It's just that, this is sometimes phrased as, well, the more worried you are about Iran's nuclear bomb, the more these airstrikes look like a good idea. But I don't actually see the argument for that. The airstrikes are not an optimal way of dealing with this, one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But no, I have zero concern that Iran is going to launch an unprovoked nuclear first strike at Israel under any imaginable circumstance.
See, I think I'm not quite as sanguine as you are. I agree. I would say I agree at this point with two empirical points. I think, first of all, assuming that the current distribution of power in Iran stays as it is, I agree. I don't think there's going to be a first strike by Iran. And second, I actually think the domestic political fortunes of Ahmadinejad are actually trending in the opposite direction from the scenario I just posited for you, which is I think his power is declining rather than increasing. And there's a whole bunch of metrics that you could point to on that. Now, that's what?
Okay.
And that said, though, the prospect, I actually do think Ahmadinejad, if he were to have his finger on the button, could do something that crazy. There is nothing I have seen in any analysis that suggests to me otherwise. Ahmadinejad, I think, is the 21st century equivalent of the Boxer Rebellion in China. This is a guy who actually thinks bullets can't hurt him. Literally believes that. We're not talking about a metaphor here. There was that business in when he gave the UN the speech at the UN, I think the first year he was president, where he actually said that he could see all of the delegates being dumbstruck by the brilliance of his rhetoric or something to that effect. Sure. That's scary. That for me is very, very scary. And so, I think this is someone who doesn't necessarily care about the material implications of wiping Israel off the face of the map. Now, that doesn't, that said, I don't think you can therefore predicate U.S. foreign policy on the possibility of Ahmadinejad taking over. I think you've got to consider what the odds of that are happening, and I don't think they're actually that good. But
right,
I do think...
The other thing I was going to say was that even in sort of scenarios along those lines of, is nuclear-armed Islamic country experiences some kind of regime turnover, the much more plausible and worrying scenario, I think, has to do with Pakistan, and not even necessarily seizing control of the Pakistan government and launching nuclear weapons at India for no reason, but simply some turmoil that leads it so that nukes might get lost, or there's a loss of central command and control over them. I think there are a lot of worries to be kind of had in that vicinity. Nevertheless, nobody appears to believe that preventative American airstrikes against Pakistani nuclear facilities
would make sense.
Are the right way to handle this.
No, and I think that's an excellent point.
Certainly not now.
Yeah. No, I think that ties actually back to the Iraq problem, which is, I think one of the mistakes I think that was made in the debate about Iraq, and I think a fair number of Bob Graham, I remember from Florida, actually made this argument, I think the best, was that focusing too much on Iraq wasn't the problem was the opportunity cost of focusing on Iraq. That is, there were a number of other foreign policy problems out there that were equally serious, obviously Al-Qaeda being one of them, and that by devoting so much resources towards Iraq, you're neglecting all these other areas. And I think the fact that you're bringing up Pakistan points out that if we expend too much energy focusing on Iran, there are other foreign policy problems out there. There are other scenarios where you could have a crazy man get a hold of a nuke that are likelier to happen than in the case of Iran. So, I mean, that's worth bringing. I agree with you that that's worth bringing up.
I mean, it's not that, we should bomb Pakistan instead of bombing Iran.
Right.
But that, part of being... Well, I mean, the essence of being this superpower with global interests all around the world is that you have to try and keep a measured perspective on any given particular issue.
Right.
Right. And, you can't adopt sort of risk-reward analyses, with regard to some specific country that you're not willing to apply globally. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what are really the issues here? And it's a game of trying to make sure things don't totally fall apart. And I have to say, on the Iran issue, without making too sharp an accusation, but I think it would behoove people writing on this to recall that the United States of America and Israel are different countries with different interests and different kinds of scopes of concern.
I agree completely.
It may make sense for Israel to be overwhelmingly concerned with Iran and Iranian influence in the Middle East as a policy problem, but the United States, even in the Middle East, has other substantial kinds of interests.
Yeah. Although it should be worth pointing out that the other substantial interests, i.e. Saudi Arabia, are equally freaked out about the prospect of an Iranian bomb. I mean, the Israelis are concerned, but the Saudis are equally concerned, I would argue. So
sure. No. But I mean, we have concerns with Al-Qaeda, for example, that Israel does not have.
No, that's fair. Yeah, I agree.
To say nothing of, and concerns related to concerns with Pakistan that they don't have. We have, North Korea, China, problems all around the world.
Right.
We are a large country with global interests.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point, and I just lost my train of thought about what the next thing I was going to say was about.
Well, I mean, where I was going with that is that, more outlandish scenarios about a first strike aside, I think the real reason both the Israeli and the Saudi government are very worried about this is simply because, an Iranian nuclear bomb would have real consequences for the balance of power in that region.
Yeah. No, now I remember. I mean,
which is not something we should ignore.
Yeah.
But the implications of growing Iranian power are simply less for the United States than they are for Saudi Arabia or for Turkey or for Israel or, other medium-sized countries that are adjacent to Iran. You can probably make do one way or the other.
The other thing is, I mean, it's worth pointing out, I'm actually more sanguine about the U.S. policy on Iran, I think, maybe than most. I mean, the thing that always ticks me off about the Bush administration's policy on Iran is the fact that they actually passed in 2003 when the Iranians went to them and said, look, we want to make a grand bargain here. we're willing to talk about the nuclear program. We're willing to talk about, stabilization in Iraq. Just don't quit talking about regime change. And, it's clear that and this has come out in a whole series of stories since then, that basically Cheney's office vetoed that. Believing that we could continue the rollback. And that kills me. Now, that said, after that massive, massive screw-up, I don't think the administration has done a horrible job on Iran in the sense of, we've actually gotten a couple, UN Security Council resolutions through on this. We've gotten the Europeans where they're in a situation where they agree with the United States on this. And you're actually seeing blowback in Iran from the fact of, we've managed to isolate ourselves pretty good on this issue. And so, I actually do think I'm concerned about the future, but I don't think U.S. policy has been too bad since it made that massive screw-up in 2003.
Well, on the one hand, I think you're right. On the other hand, I don't think it's right to think of that as, like, a screw-up that sort of just happened to have happened and is in the past. Anyway, the fact that was how the administration responded, and the fact that it wasn't just a one-off thing, but it's very consistent with a sort of broad, intellectual framework and argument that's out there. It makes me believe that the administration continues to be animated by the same impulses that led to that rejection. I'm less convinced of that. Consistent with?
I said I'm less convinced of that,
though. A much smarter approach to this question.
Wait, say that last one again?
Lots of the things they've done since then are consistent with more than one
interpretation
approach to the region.
Yeah. That's possible.
It could be that they've gotten smarter, or it could be that they're just trying to... I think Sam Gardner wrote a paper for the Century Foundation called The End of the Summer of Diplomacy, where he sketched out a scenario that seemed plausible to me, which is that what the administration is doing at the moment is basically making a show of exhausting the diplomatic options without making good faith efforts at diplomacy. On the other hand, that could not be what they're doing. I sort of can't read the lines of the president.
I agree. It's impossible. I mean, I think... On the one hand, I think that the elements that were, in ascendance rejecting the 2003 proposal by the Iranians are on the decline now. I don't think Cheney's office has quite the leverage they'd used to. I mean, not to dismiss them entirely. But that said, you're right. I mean, in the end, this boils down to what George W. Bush thinks. And I'll admit I have some concern there because it's not clear to me that Bush recognizes the potential fallout from from a military option against Iran.
Right. The tone of the response to the Iraq Study Group's recommendations, coming, not only from Bush, but also from Condoleezza Rice, who in theory is like the good guy in this administration, didn't strike me as all that encouraging. I mean, I actually agree that the specific ISG recommendation for diplomacy with Iran didn't make an enormous amount of sense to me.
Right.
But the manner in which that was being rejected, and the rhetoric with which that rejection was presented, didn't suggest to me a sort of narrow technical concern that the way Baker and Hamilton had framed the issue was incorrect, but rather a broad rejection of the idea of seeking peaceful coexistence with the Iranian regime.
Yeah. No, I take your point on that.
Right. I mean, to say something like, well, if they wanted stability in Iraq, they would do it anyway, is like, you don't grasp either the concept of a compromise, or you just don't believe it's possible to reach agreements with the other side.
My guess is it's the latter. I don't think they think agreement is possible, and so on a whole series of issues, and so yeah.
And if agreement isn't possible, war probably is the right thing to do. Which is not me saying that war is the right thing to do, but
if that assumption is correct, then
the logic
follows,
is constantly pushing toward war.
Right.
If that's your belief about this other government.
Yeah. Now, this is something that bothers me about. I've had to reread the March 2006 National Security Strategy because I'm teaching it tomorrow. And the thing that strikes me, though, about reading it is that the assumption repeatedly made in there, and it's something that the Bush team talks about consistently, is we're in this for the generation. That this is something that we've got to keep doing, and this is a generation-long conflict, which is fine if that they're probably correct in some ways. Except if it's going to be a generation-long conflict, then it might have occurred to these guys that the only way you can wage this kind of conflict is if you have a pretty large consensus within the United States that this is the right thing to do. And the problem is they've gone about the policy in such a way that almost guarantees they're going to have a large consensus thinking this is not the right policy to do. And so it's a self-defeating strategy, and it puzzles the hell out of me.
I also have to say they do not. Right-wingers sometimes put this as like they do a poor job of communicating their underlying philosophy, but they're extremely secretive.
Yeah.
As to what the policy is toward Iran and toward Syria and toward the broader regional question. It's now gone on for so long that we're used to the idea that the Bush administration has a long-term unarticulated goal of using the war in Iraq as a fulcrum on which to leverage the overthrow of a whole series of governments in that region. Mm-hmm. But it's genuinely weird for this to continue as such a heavy theme in sort of the press and in the Bush administration allies' description of what's happening, but not to be, really articulated as policy in any substantial way. You see what may or may not be hints at it in sort of snatches of phrases that people use. But nobody knows what a balance of power that favors freedom is. And that's supposed to be the goal of our national security strategy. Yeah.
A lot of IR people like to make fun of that phrase because it seems contradictory.
Right. But it's actually puzzling, right? Maybe it's just a silly phrase, but you feel like someone who wrote that could sit down and in a paragraph explain, maybe in a way that would be satisfactory to IR professors, but wouldn't be great in a document. In a speech, what it's supposed to mean. Yeah. But I've just genuinely never seen an explanation of what the goal of American policy in the region is supposed to be in a comprehensible way.
Did you read the March 2006 document?
Yes.
It's as these things go, I actually think it's relatively clear. And actually, what's striking is the comparison between the March 2006 one and the original September 2002 is the emphasis on democracy, because suddenly, the extent to which democracy is the cure-all for all of what, ails the world. It was an element of the 2002 one. It is everything in the 2006 one. And that's one of those interesting debates, I think, among that we're going to keep having about whether or not they're right to focus so much on that. But I think
there are these well-known and sort of endlessly trod over ambiguities in that claim. Yeah. They're endlessly trod over in the public discussion. Yeah. About democracy, liberalism, secularism, pro-American forces, moderate forces, blah, blah. And none of that, there's just no attempt to clarify what it is the administration is saying. It's pretty clear that when Bush and Rice talk about Lebanon, that they use the word democracy to mean something almost unrelated to a political system organized around regular elections in which majority votes prevails. What they mean by democracy in Lebanon is checking the influence of pro-Syrian political parties.
Right. Or when they talk about democracy, and yet they also in the same document have to deal with Hamas, having just won the elections in Palestine, and yet that somehow doesn't count. They actually, the Hamas thing is interesting because in that they actually kind of acknowledge that there might have been potential problem. But, this is the problem with trying to translate, sort of theories about the democratic piece into actual policy implementation, which is there's some messy stuff going on in terms of,
2006 is just extremely late in the day, I think, to be not trying to address any of these things. It's the kind of thing where when the president says it in 2002, you raise these objections and you think, aha, these are some clever objection raising dudes.
Yeah.
4 years later, when there's been no progress made by the people leading the country on trying to clarify where they stand on these questions, you start to worry.
Yeah. Well, that leads us to, I think, who's going to lead the country in 2008.
Right.
there was this really hip online video that I saw. It was a really viral thing, where Hillary Clinton said she's in.
Yes.
And
it was shocking almost to hear her announce.
Using the internet. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just incredibly surprised to hear her announce. It was like out of left field.
Yeah, I know. And
nobody could have predicted it.
Matt, using the internet as a way of sort of...
We're saying this offline. I managed to become bored of the 2008 primaries already, like months, less than a month into 2007. I think it's problematic.
You've already hit campaign fatigue. That's a bad sign.
No, I mean it's at the intersection of campaigns are getting announced sooner and sooner, and
right.
yet on blogs and so forth, you need to talk more and more about them. When it seems like it ought, in some sense, to be the reverse. That the news cycle is going to be faster. The campaign should start later.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Mickey Kaus, the filer faster thesis. That if it takes people less time to process information, then we could just hold off on this until January 2008, and then start things going.
I mean, especially because there's actually some evidence from 2004 that that's true. That the sort of relevant portion of the campaign was actually quite short. And that there was a whole kind of 6-9 months almost of kind of pointless verbiage, but that, the real campaign just went in December 2003 and January 2004, and that was kind of all there was to it. That this whole earlier phase where Kerry had been the front runner and where Dean sort of came from behind against him, and something about Dick Gephardt, none of that mattered in the end, and like all these pages were spilled and it was meaningless.
Well, yeah. I mean, Matt, do you want to we could combine and launch a blog boycott of any discussion of campaign 2008 until I think the blogs should get together and agree that until Labor Day 2007 we don't have to talk about this.
That would be nice. It's I feel like I have a credible commitment problem of some kind here, but I would feel better about that kind of world.
That's true. I mean, but I don't know if I completely agree with you. I mean, I might be less fatigued than you, mostly because I don't normally have to pay attention to this, so it's sort of one of those things that I occasionally dip into and notice. I was very amused, for example, with the when Hillary announced about how all the cable channels were saying Hillary's using the internet in a creative way to bond with voters, and someone who blogs it's a little bit passé.
Sure. Not that creative.
Yeah, exactly. Not that creative, not terribly shocking. I do think that the Obama thing intrigues me in that, let's face it, up until, a couple months ago, the assumption was it was going to be, can anyone knock off Hillary Clinton? And, yes. I mean, I think Obama actually genuinely shifted the dynamics of the race, even this early, in that I think he's perceived at least as a co-front runner, which was, I didn't think anyone was going to be able to pull that off, at least in terms of the perceptions game up until now.
Yeah, I'll say, though, I'm more interested in the Republican race than the Democratic race.
Okay.
Because I think with Democrats, you see basically two big things that it's sort of well-known Democrats disagree about.
Yeah.
Trade and kind of hawkishness. And that everyone who's major, though, in the Democratic Party is sort of now committed to fudging on both of those divides.
Huh.
And that how to fudge on them is getting pretty well understood. They had to work this out for 2006. As best I can tell, everyone sort of they draw from the same circle of people on substantive matters. They have competing teams of political operatives.
Right.
Whereas on the Republican side, it strikes me as more likely that you might see clearly articulated disagreements coming forward. Rudy Giuliani, for example, clearly has a different view of abortion and gay rights than do most Republicans.
I suppose.
John McCain has staked himself out on national security issues in a way that's different from other people and seemingly out of spirit with
Matt, no, wait, I disagree with you on that, Matt. I mean, the thing that's going to depress me, I think, about the Republican primary, which I fear you're correct on, is that, what's interesting is that the three major candidates at this point, Giuliani, Romney, and McCain, all came out in favor of the surge that Bush proposed, for example. There wasn't any differentiation on a major, foreign policy issue. The areas where they do disagree on are areas of social policy. You're right. Questions about abortion, questions about sort of cultural issues, and so on and so forth. But I mean, you don't think there's a parallel set of democratic issues where that are, how do I put this? Not as crucial as you would think, but yet are a nice way to sort of develop different brand images?
I mean, there are. I just don't see any of the contenders doing it. Whereas I think on the Republican side, I mean, you named 3 guys, right? But there's this obvious political space on the Republican side for a candidate who can present himself as more authentically a cultural traditionalist.
Right. Well, Sam Brown, I think you bought... Yeah.
He's less aggressively hawkish. Yeah. Because the interesting thing is that at this point, the Iraq War appears to have become a political problem for Republicans.
Yeah, that's
but it's something that McCain and Giuliani can't at all distance themselves from the foreign policy hawks because they're too unorthodox in too many other ways, or at least untrusted. So, I mean, the war is like what they have to prove that they're real conservatives, whereas a Sam Brownback or a Mike Huckabee doesn't need to prove himself in that kind of way and can afford to express more kind of skepticism. And I think you might see that.
I actually think you're right about McCain. I think you're wrong about Giuliani, though. Because Giuliani is identified with 9/11. He's not identified with the Iraq War. So I think it would be possible for Giuliani to start offering criticism. And furthermore, if I was Giuliani, I would start doing that. I'd start saying, the Bush administration is not managing the war. The war could be managed better because presumably, if you're Giuliani, you want the idea that you're a competent manager to be one of the key messages you're going to make, because certainly that would distinguish them from the Bush administration.
Sure, although I think, Giuliani, I think, is doomed, no matter what. So
you think he's doomed no matter what?
I presume to give him advice on that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, on the Democratic side, I hope to see some more differentiation, but I don't really think you're going to see it. I mean, there's some sense in which Edwards has positioned himself furthest to the left, and Clinton furthest toward the center. But it's not entirely clear to me why that is. What the evidence for that is.
I would argue it's economics. It's popular. The one thing I'm curious about is whether on either side you're going to see economic populism emerge. Or used as a way to sort of funnel an insurgency campaign against the established frontrunners, as it were. And I think Edwards is clearly positioned himself.
Well, populism, it gets to be a pretty vague term. I mean, Edwards and Clinton strike me as having identical records, more or less, on sort of trade policy and so on and so forth.
Really? I mean,
Edwards out of office has really kind of tuned up the rhetoric a lot. But, it would be interesting to see a major candidate run a seriously trade-skeptical campaign simply because it would force the trade skeptics to do what they haven't really done and put on the table some kind of idea about what it is they actually want to do.
Well, to be clear, when I say populism, though, I'm not just talking about trade. I mean, I think it's also, focus on income redistribution within the country, the extent to which you want to regulate business. I mean, there's a whole immigration.
Sure, right. Yes. No, I mean, there are a whole range of other issues.
Right.
But on those issues, the differences between different Democrats strike me as primarily rhetorical and not particularly substantive.
Okay. Yeah. It'll be interesting.
I mean, all of the Democrats want to raise the minimum wage in a moderate way. Yeah. All the Democrats now are committed to the same labor law reform. None of the Democrats want to, drastically raise the top marginal income tax rate. All of them want to see the Bush tax cuts expire. It all comes down, pretty similar, if you ask me.
Well, I mean, but don't you think that one way they're going to differentiate themselves? I mean, you know how this works. They're all going to start issuing plans for how to fix entitlements or other, I mean, particularly domestic.
Healthcare. They're all going to have healthcare.
I think healthcare is going to be the issue where all these guys on both sides are probably going to, that's going to be the issue that people are going to care about, and that's going to be one. I would say healthcare and taxes, actually. I think those are the areas where they're probably going to try to distinguish themselves, and where they want to distinguish themselves in some sense. And
yeah. I guess, my guess is that the Democrats are not going to come out all that distinctly on healthcare. That could be wrong. It certainly seems to be the policy area that people want to talk about at the moment.
Which, as we've talked about before, I mean, I always feel bad about this because healthcare just puts me to sleep as a policy issue. I know it's terribly important, but it's just not something that I can ever get invested in.
Sure, it's a little dull.
A little, yeah.
I think it's a major part of the case for single-payer healthcare is that once it's implemented, it's less prone to getting talked about than other kind of systems.
So, as bloggers, we have incentives to somehow have the candidates not talk about this.
Some of these plans, like what Romney's done in Massachusetts, if you have that kind of mandates plus subsidies plus regulations, you're dooming yourself to a really endless series of political disputes about the exact nature of the mandate. Mm-hmm. And, I think people are going to find that really boring.
Well, if we're lucky, it'll be an incredibly boring phase where they just issue healthcare plans and don't, nothing sexy happens until Labor Day, and then we can afford to ignore this.
We can just avoid talking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've hit the century mark, or the hour mark. I think my computer's about to shut down, so...
Okay, sure. Time to wrap it up.
Yeah, it's time to wrap it up. But, a stimulating conversation as always, Matt.
Yes, exactly. Go Bears.
Bears. All right, go Bears.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.